in Harbour Heights, where the homes are as precisely arranged as the social hierarchy. Clara Thompson was infamous for her zealous enforcement of community standards. What she wasn't known for was her ability to distinguish between genuine rule violations and innocent hot dog consumption, a distinction that would prove surprisingly consequential on that sunny Saturday in July. My name is Emily Carter, 38, a high school English teacher and reluctant witness to what my students would later dub the Great Harbour Heights hot dog incident. I'd moved back to my childhood hometown last year when Dad, at 74, developed some minor health issues after Mom passed away. Nothing serious. Just the kind of things that made me feel better being 20 minutes away instead of 3 states over. Dad, Dr. Henry Carter, a retired corporate attorney with degrees from Harvard and Yale, had refused to downsize from the 4-bedroom colonial where I grew up. "This is home, Emily," he'd said when I suggested a condo might be easier to manage. 42 years of memories. Your mother's garden, the height markers on the kitchen doorframe. I'm not going anywhere until they carry me out feet first. Dad had largely avoided Clara's notice, partly because his property was impeccably maintained, a habit from his corporate days, and partly because he seldom engaged in the social politics of Harbour Heights. He walked his golden retriever, Max, twice daily, tended Mum's rose garden, and occasionally hosted his poker group, all activities well within the Harbour Heights acceptable behavior spectrum, until the hot dog. The incident occurred during Harbour Heights' annual 4th of July celebration in the community park. The HOA provided hamburgers and hot dogs, with residents bringing sides and desserts to share. Dad and I arrived fashionably late and found the celebration in full swing. We filled our plates and found seats at a picnic table near the playground, so Dad could watch the grandchildren of his poker buddies racing around the jungle gym. As Dad prepared to take another bite, a shadow fell across our table. I looked up to see Clara Thompson standing over us, her expression suggesting she'd just discovered something unpleasant on the bottom of her designer sandal. "Excuse me," she said, addressing Dad while pointedly ignoring me. "Perhaps you're unaware, but food consumption is restricted to the designated eating areas." Dad glanced around. We were seated at a picnic table, surrounded by other people eating. "I'm sorry. I thought this was a designated eating area," he replied mildly. "It's a picnic table." Clara's smile tightened. "The designated eating areas are clearly marked with blue tablecloths. This table is within the playground zone, Section 8. 3 of the event guidelines clearly states that no food is permitted within 20 feet of playground equipment." Dad lowered his hot dog, his expression puzzled. "I don't recall seeing that guideline before. Is it new?" "It was approved at the May board meeting and detailed in the June newsletter," Clara replied with smug satisfaction. "Page 4, if you'd bothered to read it." I felt a familiar flush of irritation. Clara had a talent for making reasonable requests sound like moral indictments. Before I could respond, Dad nodded thoughtfully. "I see. Well, we're almost finished. Would it be acceptable if we just complete our meal here, rather than relocating? It would only be a few more minutes." Clara's expression hardened. "Rules exist for everyone, regardless of age or status. If exceptions were made, we'd have chaos." Dad looked around at the children playing nearby, none of whom were eating or even interested in our picnic table. "I understand the principle, but surely some flexibility, no exceptions." Clara cut him off. "Either move to a designated area or dispose of your food immediately." I'd had enough. "Clara, we're talking about a hot dog, not hazardous waste. Dad's knees are bothering him today, and we've just gotten settled." "I don't make the rules, Emily. I merely enforce them," Clara replied with practiced condescension. Dad placed a calming hand on my arm, always the peacemaker. "It's all right, Emily. We can move." He began gathering his plate and napkins. What happened next occurred so quickly that several witnesses later gave conflicting accounts. As Dad stood, balancing his plate and drink while navigating around the picnic table bench, Clara reached for his hot dog. Whether to take it or to point at it remained a subject of neighborhood debate for months afterward. Either way, the sudden movement startled Dad, who instinctively pulled back. The hot dog, released from its bun, executed a perfect arc through the air before landing with a wet slap against Clara's pristine white capri pants, leaving a spectacular mustard and ketchup Rorschach test across her right thigh. Time seemed to stop. Conversations around us died mid-sentence. Even the children paused their play. Sensing the dramatic shift in atmosphere, Clara stood frozen, mouth open in horror, staring at the yellow and red stain spreading across the expensive fabric. "You did that deliberately," she finally gasped, her voice rising to a pitch that startled a nearby squirrel. You food vandal." Dad, mortified, reached for a napkin. "Clara, I'm so sorry. It was an accident. Let me help. Don't touch me." She stepped back, pointing a trembling finger at Dad. "This is assault. Food-based assault. I'm filing an incident report." "Clara," Dad tried again, his voice calm, despite the absurdity of the situation. "It was clearly an accident. I'll happily pay for dry cleaning." But Clara was beyond reason. Her face had flushed an alarming shade of red that clashed violently with the condiments on her pants. "The board will hear about this. There will be consequences." With that declaration, she spun on her heel and stormed off toward the clubhouse, leaving a wake of whispers and suppressed laughter behind her. The first official salvo in what neighbors would later call the condiment war arrived 3 days after the 4th of July incident, a formal violation notice taped to Dad's front door, citing intentional food misuse resulting in property damage and failure to comply with event zoning regulations. The notice demanded Dad pay $175 for Clara's ruined capri pants, plus a $50 fine for the alleged zoning violation. "This is ridiculous," I said as Dad read the notice aloud during our weekly dinner. "She can't seriously expect you to pay for an accident that happened because she grabbed at your food." Dad adjusted his reading glasses, studying the citation with the careful attention he'd once given to multi-million-dollar contracts. The violation references HOA bylaw 22.7, but that section covers exterior holiday decorations, not food at community events. And does that surprise you? Clara's never been one to let facts interfere with her mission. What's curious, Dad continued, is that this notice bears the HOA letterhead, but not the required approval signature from either the board president or the compliance committee chair. Technically, this makes it an unofficial communication. I rolled my eyes. So she's not just vindictive, she's bypassing proper procedures. Apparently, Dad set the notice aside. "I think I'll just call Howard tomorrow and clear this up." Howard Chen was the current HOA president, a retired accountant who generally took a more measured approach to governance than Clara. True to his word, Dad called Howard the next morning, only to discover that Howard and his wife were on a 3-week cruise to Alaska. His voicemail informed callers that Clara Thompson would be acting as interim president during his absence. "Well, that complicates things," Dad remarked when he shared this news with me. "I'll need to approach this differently now." Dad drafted a formal response to the violation notice, politely but firmly declining to pay either the replacement cost or the fine. Citing the accidental nature of the incident and the incorrect bylaw reference, he hand-delivered the letter to the HOA office, where Clara's assistant accepted it with visible discomfort. 2 days later, a second notice appeared, this one citing the correct bylaw regarding community event regulations, but increasing the fine to $75 for failure to promptly comply with HOA directives. A handwritten note at the bottom read, "Further delays will result in additional penalties." What followed was a bizarre escalation of administrative warfare. Each time Dad responded with a measured, legally sound rebuttal. Clara issued a new citation with increased fines. By the third notice, she had added historical pattern of non-compliance to the charges. Despite Dad's spotless record over 4 decades of residence, she's completely fabricating violations now. I fumed after the 4th notice arrived, this one threatening a lien against Dad's property if the now $375 in combined fines weren't paid within 10 days. "This is harassment." Dad remained surprisingly calm. "She's making procedural errors in each notice," he observed, failing to provide proper appeal information, citing non-existent bylaws. "Issuing threats without board approval, she's building quite a case, just not the one she thinks." The situation took an unexpected turn when Clara began canvassing the neighborhood, telling residents that Dad was mentally declining and suggesting his food assault was evidence that he could no longer safely live independently. Mrs. Abernathy, Dad's 82-year-old neighbor, and bridge partner, called to warn us after Clara visited her. She had the nerve to ask if I'd noticed signs of confusion or aggression from Henry. Miss S. Abernathy reported indignantly. I told her, the only confusion I've noticed is why anyone elected her to the board in the first place. The community tension reached its peak when Clara used her temporary presidential authority to call an emergency board meeting to address what she termed ongoing compliance issues and potential safety concerns. The meeting was scheduled for a Tuesday evening at the Harbor Heights Clubhouse, and the agenda specifically listed Carter property violations as the primary topic. She's really doing this, I said, staring at the meeting notification in disbelief. She's convening the entire board to discuss your case without even waiting for Howard to return. Dad checked his calendar thoughtfully. Tuesday at 7:00 p.m. That works perfectly. You're actually going to attend this witch hunt. Of course, he replied, marking the date with a small smile. I wouldn't miss it for the world. The Harbor Heights Clubhouse was uncharacteristically packed for a Tuesday evening board meeting. Word had spread about Clara's campaign against the hot dog terrorist, a nickname some of the younger residents had given Dad. Much to his amusement, and the community had turned out in force to witness the showdown. The room hummed with whispered conversations and speculation. Clara entered from the side door precisely at 7:00 p.m., flanked by two board members who looked distinctly uncomfortable with the unusual attendance. She wore a navy blazer with a gold HOA pin on the lapel and carried a thick binder emblazoned with the Harbor Heights logo. Her expression, when she spotted Dad in the audience, flickered briefly between surprise and satisfaction. "Good evening," she began, her voice carrying that particular tone of forced pleasantness that set my teeth on edge. Due to President Chen's continued absence, I'll be chairing tonight's meeting. We have several important matters to discuss. But first, I'd like to address the issue that I know has been a topic of considerable community interest. She paused, clearly enjoying the dramatic tension. As many of you are aware, there was an unfortunate incident during our 4th of July celebration involving a resident who deliberately damaged another resident's property with food and has subsequently refused to make appropriate restitution. Murmurs rippled through the audience. Dad remained perfectly still beside me, his expression neutral. Clara continued, "While we typically handle compliance issues privately, the repeated refusal to acknowledge wrongdoing, combined with concerning behavioral patterns that may indicate larger issues, necessitates board intervention." She opened her binder and removed a stack of papers. "I've documented 5 separate violation notices issued to Henry Carter over the past 2 weeks, none of which have been addressed appropriately. Additionally, several residents have expressed concerns about Mr. Carter's recent behavior and decision-making capacity." The murmurs grew louder, with distinct sounds of disagreement from several corners of the room. Miss S. Abernathy, seated directly behind us, made an audible scoff of disapproval. Therefore, Clara pressed on, raising her voice slightly. "I recommend the board approve an official censure, apply the accumulated fines to Mr. Carter's HOA account, and establish a 3-month probationary period, during which any additional violations would result in more significant penalties." She looked directly at Dad now. "Would you like to address these issues before the board votes, Mr. Carter?" Dad stood slowly, smoothing his khakis as he rose. "Thank you, Miss Thompson. I would indeed." He made his way to the front of the room with unhurried dignity, nodding to neighbors as he passed. When he reached the podium, he removed a single sheet of paper from his pocket, unfolded it carefully, and placed it before him. "Good evening, everyone. For those who don't know me, I'm Henry Carter. I've lived in Harbor Heights for 42 years, raised my daughter here, and served on various committees throughout that time." His voice was clear and measured, the same tone he'd used in countless corporate boardrooms. "Currently, I chair the HOA Legal Committee, a position I've held for the past 8 years. Clara's head snapped up at this, her eyes widening slightly. Clearly, she hadn't connected Henry Carter with Dr. Henry Carter, JD, head of the legal committee. In her research, Dad continued, "I'd like to address Miss Thompson's concerns systematically. First, regarding the July 4th incident, what occurred was plainly an accident, witnessed by over a dozen residents, several of whom have provided written statements to that effect." He gestured toward Miss S. Abernathy, who held up a folder of papers with a triumphant smile. "Second, Regarding the violation notices, each one contains significant procedural errors that render them invalid under our bylaws. They were issued without proper authorization, cite incorrect or non-existent regulations, fail to provide mandated appeal information, and escalate penalties without board approval, all direct violations of HOA procedures. Dad paused, allowing his words to settle over the room. Clara's expression had shifted from confidence to confusion, to the dawning horror of someone realizing they've made a catastrophic miscalculation. Third, and most troublingly, Dad continued, his voice taking on a steelier edge, Mish Thompson has engaged in a systematic campaign to undermine my reputation through false claims about my mental competence statements that constitute both defamation under state law and elder discrimination under federal housing regulations. The room had gone completely silent. Even the children who had been playing in the adjoining room seemed to sense the gravity of the moment and quieted their games. As chair of the legal committee, I am obligated to inform the board that Miss Thompson's actions have exposed the HOA to significant liability. Should these actions continue, I would have no choice but to recommend the association retain outside counsel to address potential legal consequences. Dad looked directly at Clara now, his expression not angry but something almost like pity. However, I believe this situation can be resolved simply, without legal escalation. I propose that all invalid notices be formally withdrawn, that Miss Thompson issue a public apology for both the invalid citations and the defamatory statements, and that the board review our compliance procedures to prevent similar situations in the future. He folded his paper and slipped it back into his pocket. Thank you for your attention. I'm happy to answer any questions the board might have. The silence that followed was broken by a slow building, applause that started with Mrs. Abernathy and spread until most of the room had joined in. Clara stood frozen behind the table, her carefully constructed case collapsing around her. The aftermath of what became known as the hot dog hearing transformed Harbor Heights in ways no one could have predicted. Howard Chen returned from his Alaskan cruise to find the community dynamic significantly altered and a stack of incident reports waiting on his desk. After reviewing the evidence and consulting with Dad, he called an official board meeting to address the situation. Clara was conspicuously absent from this meeting, having submitted a letter citing personal obligations that prevented her attendance. The board unanimously voted to invalidate all violation notices issued during Howard's absence, to establish clearer protocols for temporary leadership transitions, and, most significantly, to create an ethics committee to review compliance procedures and ensure fair enforcement of community standards. Dad was asked to chair this new committee, an offer he initially declined, suggesting it might appear retaliatory. The goal isn't to punish Clara, he explained to me later. It's to improve the system that allowed the situation to develop in the first place. Instead, he recommended a diverse committee representing various segments of the community, long-time residents, newer homeowners, families with children, and seniors. The board accepted his suggestion, though they insisted he serve as an advisory member, given his legal expertise. Clara's public apology, when it finally came, was brief and carefully worded, clearly crafted by an attorney to acknowledge wrongdoing while minimizing legal exposure. She expressed regret for any procedural oversights and for any statements that may have been misinterpreted regarding Dr. Carter's capabilities. Not exactly heartfelt, but sufficient to satisfy the board's requirements. What surprised everyone, however, was Clara's announcement that she would not seek re-election when her term ended in 3 months. Rumors circulated that her husband's company was transferring him to Phoenix, a convenient explanation that allowed her to exit gracefully rather than face the community's changed perception of her leadership. For several weeks after the meeting, neighbors stopped by Dad's house with baked goods, offers of help with yard work, and sometimes just to chat. Many shared their own stories of run-ins, with Clara's aggressive enforcement style, revealing a pattern that had affected far more residents than anyone had realized. You know what's ironic? Mrs. Abernathy observed during one of our regular bridge games. Clara was so obsessed with property values that she couldn't see she was damaging something far more valuable, our sense of community. Dad nodded thoughtfully. Neighborhoods are more than just real estate. They're social ecosystems. When rules become weapons rather than frameworks, the whole system suffers. 1 year after the infamous hot dog incident, Harbour Heights held its annual 4th of July celebration in the community park. The event was organized by the newly formed Community Engagement Committee, which had replaced Clara's event planning committee with a more inclusive, less regimented approach to neighborhood gatherings. The changes were immediately apparent. Instead of the sterile, rules-heavy environment of previous years, the park hummed with genuine community energy. Food tables were arranged throughout the space rather than restricted to designated zones. Children darted between play areas and picnic tables without crossing arbitrary boundaries. Neighbors who had barely spoken during Clara's reign chatted comfortably while sharing homemade dishes. Dad and I arrived early this time, as he'd been asked to say a few words before the informal program began. At 75, he showed no signs of slowing down, still walking Max daily, tending Mum's roses, and serving as the unofficial elder statesman of Harbour Heights. The only concession to last year's controversy was his choice of lunch a hamburger instead of a hot dog, which he claimed was just a culinary preference, not a trauma response. Howard Chen welcomed everyone with a brief speech about community spirit, then introduced Dad to scattered applause and good-natured hot dog jokes. Dad approached the microphone with his characteristic easy dignity. "A year ago, I stood in this park holding a hot dog that would unexpectedly change Harbour Heights," he began, drawing laughter from the crowd. Not because the hot dog itself was remarkable, but because it became the catalyst for us to examine what kind of community we truly wanted to be. He gestured around at the relaxed gathering. "Look at us today, children playing freely, neighbors connecting across generational and cultural lines. A community defined not by rigid enforcement of rules, but by mutual respect and genuine care for one another." His expression grew more thoughtful. "My late wife used to say that the true measure of a neighborhood wasn't in its property values or aesthetic uniformity, but in how it responded to adversity, how neighbors supported each other through challenges, both large and small." Dad smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "So, as we celebrate Independence Day, let's also celebrate our interdependence, our connection to each other as neighbors and friends. And remember that sometimes the most important community discussions start in unexpected ways, even with a hot dog." As the afternoon progressed, I watched Dad engage with neighbors across generations, advising a young couple on their fence installation plans, discussing baseball with the middle schoolers who lived next door, reminiscing with his fellow seniors about Harbour Heights' early days. In each interaction, I saw what made him such a natural community leader: his genuine interest in people over policies, his belief that rules should serve communities rather than define them. "You know what the real irony is?" he said thoughtfully as we walked home. "Clara was right about one thing: community standards do matter. She just misunderstood what the most important standards are." "Which are?" I prompted. "Kindness, flexibility, perspective." He smiled. "The understanding that sometimes a hot dog is just a hot dog, not an assault weapon or a violation of section, whatever. I laughed. "Pretty sure that's not in the bylaws." "Maybe it should be," he replied. "The hot dog clause in all enforcement actions. Board members shall first consider whether they're making a mountain out of a molehill or a federal case out of a frankfurter.